So the first study I did on this line, in predicting medication adherence, we monitored people for 8 weeks. I'll tell you a little bit more about this MIMS cap in a later slide. I'll tell you about it now and skip it later. The MIMS cap, it's a cap that has a little microchip in it, and we've looked at this in my lab. You know, how much do you have to thread it onto the threads of the bottle for it to actually record? It's pressure sensitive cap. So every time there's a little bit of, and we had someone with MS, we tried to make sure that, you know, we weren't getting false data in the study. Every time, you know, you turn it, or every time you take it on and off, it records. So you get information about if they're opening the bottle. And of course, nurses love to say to me, but you don't know if they're taking it. Intentional non-adherence is not, we're not going to help with that. If people are intending to not take their meds because they think that they're having side effects, or there's a problem. My mother-in-law, oh my God, I did a study on personality once and I understood her. These young doctors, they don't know what they're doing. They're prescribing too much. I'm allergic. So, you know, that's intentional non-adherence. But then I looked at her pill organizer and she had like 3 days of all the same medication stuffed in there because she just used it as a carrying case. So sometimes people don't know how to use their pill organizers, you know, the Sunday through Saturday ones. But anyway, so we looked at medication adherence using this nice measure, electronic measure of adherence. Yeah, this was in San Antonio. These were my ladies. They gave me permission to take their pictures. So I just want you, these are twins. I had to go to the church supper, you know, we had red Jello with something, I think it was whipping cream, you know, mixed in with it. It reminded me of my growing up in Wisconsin days, okay, which is one of the reasons I like Pullman. Pullman reminds me a little bit of my Wisconsin days. And I was just back there last week, so it's fresh in my mind. So we had 96 participants. This is the age, the range, the financial. I do a little thing. Wendy prefers to do an actual income scale. When I work with her, she likes to do it that way. And I'll speak about Wendy Rogers and our mutual connection with Wendy at some other point here this morning. But I tend to just ask people, do you have enough money to make ends meet? Do you have more than enough money so that having enough money to make ends meet with a little left over is 3. 4 is having enough money to do whatever you want. You know, I can't tell you, there is not one person that I've had that has said they have enough money to do whatever they want. So most people are at a 3. We have enough money to make ends meet and have a little left over. And then 2 is I have enough money to make ends meet, and 1 is I'm not making ends meet. So I have found that people are more receptive to filling that scale out than they are to actually saying what their income is, so I don't lose data that way. And I also get a sense of what they're feeling in terms of their financial well-being. I have had people say 1, 2, and 3. I just never a 4. And I've had people say a 3 when they were not affluent by any means, but felt like they were doing okay. So it's interesting. That's a whole other area of research that I won't go into. But that's what that is. Then educational and years of education, severity of illness, GDS is geriatric depression scale. That's a low amount of depression. Activity, how active are they? You know, most of them, you know, who are community dwelling, self-managing individuals are getting around. And then adherence, the average was about 80%, but the range was pretty big. So that's the monitor I've already told you about with a little microchip in the device. This is the kind of information you get from that medication event monitor. It's made by Ardex. And it also can give you can change the dates. So in the intervention study, I had to change the dates because I didn't want the research assistants who are going to the homes to get the data downloaded, and I didn't want to lose data, so I they were going out every couple months because they didn't want to lose data. But I also, if they were a week late, because of whatever schedules, were involved, we could always just change the interval that we were looking at and get not only percentage of days that they were adherent to their medication, but also the interdose interval. So interdose interval is the quartile within their target time that they're supposed to take the medication. So, and that's the one I used for the later intervention study, but this time I just used percentage of days that they actually took the medication. So you get a calendar, but you also get that information. I was worried about this. This never wants to come out. It's a nice little, I'll tell you what it is. It's a nice little kind of structural equation model looking at medial temporal function, which is what I was calling it, because at the time I was working with Betty, or at least I had just come out of Betty's stuff. So medial temporal is more memory, versus the prefrontal factor. And I had a composite of measures that I was calling prefrontal measures, and a composite very much just in the Glitzky, framework. And then the important part of that little schematic that I was having trouble with saving for some reason is, and I can pull it up later if anybody really wants to see it, but is that the executive function beta, the path coefficient for that relationship from that composite to the outcome of medication adherence was 0.44, standardized beta. So the other is nothing. Obviously, that in this community dwelling, independently living group of people that we're so concerned about because we want to keep them living independently, the only thing that was influencing executive function, the only medication adherence, was the executive function composite. So that led me on to a pilot intervention study. And then after the pilot, I went to this multifaceted prospective memory intervention. So this was a randomized clinical trial testing the effects of this intervention. The intervention was, I'll tell you a little bit more about later, but I want you to know that I set this up to be a real test. So one of the things as a reviewer for NIH that I look for is, are we doing care as usual and it's not defined? We're actually setting up these things against an active control. So the active control in this study, everybody got the same education about hypertension, the deleterious effects of hypertension, and the general information about medications, antihypertensive medications. They also, to fill out the time so that the time was equivalent between the control group and the intervention group, got the same amount of time, same number of minutes as the intervention condition. And that nurse would talk about things like fall prevention. We had a fall prevention intervention that they were doing. And also social interaction, which most people like to have a nurse come to the house every week for 4 weeks, and talk about them. So that worked out pretty well. By the way, later, not to forget to tell you this, we didn't need 4 weeks. The data showed that we got them up after the, first, second week. Second week was more to ensure that they had it. Did you give it? Did they get it? Do they have it? But we didn't need to do the third and fourth week. So in future work, we can drop that off because we have empirical evidence. But just to say that this was a pretty active control condition. So the diagram here is just that non-adherence leads to increased severity of hypertension, which leads to further declines in working memory executive function. Age, cognitive aging, leads to declines in working memory executive function, and that the intervention was going to moderate this effect on self-management and medication adherence, and then improve blood pressure control. We did not see improvement in clinical outcomes. There's a lot you can't control. You can't control what they're prescribed. And that would be a really good study if you could. Yeah. To give you a little bit more information about the intervention itself, Gil Einstein is a wonderful colleague. And I flew him and Dan to Tucson with a little bit of money that I had to start this thing up. And he said, I've been thinking about this. And what is it? What components are required for successful prospective memory? If you ever get a chance to work with him, I would get him on board.
I know Mark, but I don't
know.
Oh,
and Mark's, of course, his good colleague. Yeah.
Mark's wonderful.
Yeah, exactly. And I know Mark too. But yeah, so but Gil's great. And really lives and breathes this prospective memory thing. So you have to encode the information. You have to store it, which older adults do. They just do it a little slower, than younger people might. Importantly, you have to retrieve it at the right time. You have to execute it. In the lab, in the prospective memory lab, what they have learned is that a delay of 5 seconds can make an older adult forget to do what they intended to do. So in the lab, it's often when the letter M comes up or something like that, then press the space bar, But if they've had a distracting task for as little as 5 seconds, they won't do that. And yet younger people will. They'll retain it and they'll do it. So it's important, delays between the intention to do it and the actual taking, or they're answering the phone, or they're looking at a text message or something like that. It interferes with your ability to finish it. And then monitoring it, did I do it, or did I this is where the pill organizer comes in. Did I take it, or did I just think I took it? Like if I think I forgot to turn off the oven, I go back and look. Actually, it's the grill. I'm usually worried about. My husband has a tendency to leave it on. More on the intervention. We developed strategies to address each one of those components. The strategies were redundant, so there were at least 2. They were delivered in the home with the nurse making use of the situational context. So here's one thing that I'm struggling with developing this app. Location was really important. Visual reminders are really important in the smart home. Where will they be? We used also imagery. So implementation intentions, where will you be? Let me tell you what they are first. So New Year's Day, I'm going to resolve to exercise every week. Well, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to go? Is your gym bag going to be ready and in the car? So it's actually implementation intentions. Each step, have you got that? Are you going to do it that way? So we use that also as a strategy for people learning. So this is a table. It's out of one of the articles I sent you on what the strategies were, intervention strategies, and then the different components, and then what we thought they were addressing in terms of those components. So using implementations intentions, which I just talked about, how some people call them action plans, so I don't know for sure in the literature what you're going to find, but that really helps people encode it and store it. Retrieve it, because I had I went on these visits as well, and we had one lady, okay, where are you when you're supposed to take that medication? Well, in the evening she was going to be going to sleep, right? So she put it at her bedside. So bedside table, watching the news. Where are you going to be in the evening? I had one woman who was notoriously forgetting her evening dose, and you can tell because you can look back on the calendar. Even though I didn't use that as an intervention strategy, I didn't show them because I didn't want it to change behavior. I wanted to use the strategies. But where are you? What are you doing? When you're supposed to be taking this at 6. So I'm watching the news. Well, then put your medications there. You also find that people are resistant to making them visible. They don't want I don't want my husband's medication sitting on the kitchen counter. I don't. I understand it. But if you hide them, then it's not as easy to remember. So how do you make them visible without offending people? So we also use space retrieval for learning, teach, wait, ask, then ask again, teach back kind of thing. Using an organizer, do it now, elaborate the action of taking medications. We ask them to shake the bottle or call it to their attention. People forget if they've done it because they weren't paying attention to begin with. They weren't encoding it to begin with. So call it to their attention. Convert a time-based to an event-based. That's one of McDaniel and Einstein's, cardinal sort of features. Don't tell people that they need to take their meds at a certain time. Ask them, what are you doing when you get up? Where will you be? Okay, you take them with breakfast, take them with breakfast. So change it to an event, not a clock. Get rid of the clock kind of thing. Okay, so baseline data at the university, we did all of the baseline testing. These are cognitive measures at the university. We screened for signs of dementia and severe depression. We used the geriatric depression scale. After 4 weeks of baseline monitoring with these MIMS caps, if the adherence, because what I discovered is I should have just used the last 2 weeks of the 4 week as a monitoring period, because it would have been a little lower. What we discovered is that when you first put these pills in this white bottle, it makes it more salient and it calls attention to it. So whatever you can do to call attention to something in a home when you're trying to enhance self-management would work. So we actually used 90% because of that. So we had 299 consented, we had 8 ineligibles, 29 dropped. Some people didn't want that white box sitting on their kitchen counter. They just didn't want to do it. We had 262 complete the 4th week. There were 134 that were adherent, so greater than 90%. So 128 eligible for 6 months, 63 we assigned to the education control, and 65 in the education and intervention. I'll tell you something about that. 2 of those were a couple. And they were so excited about doing it, and we let them in. And in talking with Joe Hepworth, who's a really wonderful colleague and statistician, because there's nestedness there, and I didn't want to have to deal with nestedness, with one couple. We just got rid of them because it was just easier. But they went through the intervention. Hopefully they benefited, but I don't know. I don't think they weren't willing to do it separately. So sometimes you handle these things after you have time to reflect on them, and you just control for the problems that way. So these are just sample comparisons. Really, they're just to show you that in every way the intervention group and the control group were the same. Okay, this is an interesting phenomenon. I believe in random assignment. You should get equivalents in the groups. But our intervention group had lower adherence at the start. Not significantly different. Okay, we tested it, did a t-test. Is that group different significantly from the other group? But they were different. And so when they jumped up, so everybody, even the control people, when you have a nurse in your home every week for 4 weeks, you're going to improve your adherence a little bit because someone cares. And is asking you about your family and all that kind of stuff, and started off talking about, hypertension. But they didn't really pop up that much. But the intervention group people with the strategies, did. So the strategies worked. But then, watch this. We monitored them for another 5 months. And it's just zip right back down. They still ended up higher than they were at baseline. But you can't, that's why technology is so important. That's why we have to leverage technology to improve self-management, because this is what happens. They need a constant coach, So it's just to reinforce what you're already doing here. This is percent adherence to the schedule at baseline. I've already talked to you about this, although this percentage adherence to schedule at baseline. This looks like there's a significant difference, and there wasn't. So I have to look at that and find out where that is. So point is that there was a huge difference at the end of the intervention after the RN visits, and there was almost approaching still a difference, at the end of the study. But I'm a little surprised that's showing up that way, but I took that right out of the article. I did a snip thing yesterday when I was working on this. So that must be true because that's what we published. The other thing we did is we looked at executive function as a moderator. So would so we only included people who weren't at ceiling, right? They all had to be lower than 100% on adherence. So, the question is, if this is the education group and this is the intervention group, when did they become not significantly different? So the intervention group improved adherence markedly for those people who were low on executive function. Now that says a Z-score, so it's within the sample. But at plus 0.53 Z-score, there was no longer a significant difference between the control condition and the intervention condition. So executive function, people with higher executive function, this intervention didn't help them. This is not the reason they're not taking their medication. So there's a group that's true for. But that was an interesting thing to find as well. And then prospective memory intervention was successful, but the effects weren't sustained. So that's the big thing. These are the people I worked with. I am so blessed in my life. So the current study, which is what you're interested in, is the R21 that was recently funded to translate this intervention to technology, to an app. And so we call it MedsRem. Wendy's really good at coming up with slogans, isn't she? Medication education, decision support. So I also now work with a pharmacist, Jeannie Lee, and what we're trying to do, if you're a provider, a medical provider, you can get some help in terms of, well, if someone asks you, if I have, in the hospital, for example, if they've missed their dose because they had a procedure, can they still take it and then take, the next one at the next scheduled time? So that's decision support. So if I forgot to take it this morning and I left the house and then I came back at 5 o'clock, is it still safe for me to take it? That's the decision support piece. So we're working on algorithms for each medication. There are some individual factors too that have to be taken into consideration. Age in relationship to renal and liver function and how fast they clear, but that's the decision support piece of what we're doing here. And then reminding, we're trying to make this not just an alarm system. I mean, people don't like alarms. Do you like alarms? You have a question? No. Okay. No, people don't like alarms. I agree. So what kind of an alarm? Tailor it to them, but when? When would you give it? And then monitoring, some recognition of, yes, I took it, yes, I took it. And then I have a multidisciplinary team with experts from pharmacy, human factors and aging, prospective memory, and nursing. I would be nothing without my team. Every step of the way, I have had insights and support, and this is amazing to me. Working on an interdisciplinary team is really remarkable, very satisfying. So Jeannie is coming from pharmacy, and she's a co-I on this last one. Right now we're working on wireframes for the app, which I didn't know anything about. Coding, challenge is translating the behavioral intervention to the app. And I'm not sure we're completely capturing the behavioral intervention, because there are things like location I can't manipulate with an app. You can with a smart home. And location is huge because it's a part of routine. Embedded within the routine is the visual reminder. So this is the current team minus, I don't have a picture of Gil or Dan Morrow. But these are we're working with Tracy Mitzner. Do you know Tracy? She's a colleague of Wendy. Tracy's still at Georgia Tech. Wendy moved to University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Myself, Jeannie Lee is our pharmacist. Melissa and Mike and Justin, who's on the other end, are all from Amphibian, which is a private company who does computer science and electrical engineering. There are a bunch of people like that who I couldn't do this work without. So that's kind of my spiel today. I want to recognize people that I feel like I wouldn't be anywhere without, especially the people who have participated in our studies. They're wonderful. I appreciate them every day. So Joe Hepworth was the statistician who did the moderator and found the issue with the executive function. Yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah, please.
These MEMS caps mechanism. So there are cases that it might happen that they don't using the opening the container. They forgot, for example, intentionally or unintentionally, some distraction happening.
Yeah.
They open the cap, but they don't take the peel.
Yeah.
Do you have any other mechanism to monitor to make sure they have it? Because it's opening the cap, just recording the data does not necessarily indicate that they take the pills.
I agree with you. I think there's a validity issue with each one of the ways in which we measure medication adherence. I think that's a threat to the validity of whether or not we're accurately representing medication adherence. I do think that it's better than the other things that we have available that are non-invasive. So without taking a blood sample and getting, the amount of medication that's in the blood, I think it's the best that we can do, and it's a pretty good indicator.
And on the technological side, what I was thinking, I don't know if you're using smart home sensors in your study or not, but there is looking at the data, for example, because of the motion sensors and things like that, for each period that people take medications, there might be a time period that they can monitor looking at the data afterwards. So what I was thinking, if it can be combined with, smart home sensors.
Mm-hmm.
So because I believe they looking at the time intervals and periods that for each time that they take the pills, there might be like an assistive way to make sure, rather than post-processing and taking blood. That's definitely can help.
Mm-hmm.
So
You mean in terms of the improving the validity of the medication adherence measure? I think that's one way in which there's a combined work, but there's another way. I think that this alone isn't totally going to respond to all of the needs of aging older adults. That's a little redundant, aging older adults. But, as age progresses, the kinds of environmental support that they will need in addition to just medication taking, to me, is the sort of synergy that I would see. So I think that using sensors in the home, and I've seen a lot of them. Jeffrey Kay at Oregon, State, I've talked with him. We had one of his little pill boxes that they were using Bluetooth to, monitor. Actually, he's been using sensors, and people are using beacons. But you are no farther behind than anyone else. You are ahead of the curve, I think, because you've got this interdisciplinary kind of idea about how to do this work, and you're thinking about all of these things. So I don't know about the computer science end of this or about the sensors themselves, but I can see all kinds of ways in which you can build a home that is supportive environmentally to help people stay independent as long as possible. And it moves beyond this little thing around the neck, the necklace thing where you can push the button and I've fallen and I can't get up. I mean, because sometimes this is my concern, is that people who are getting sick, they don't always fall, but there may be a difference in activity in the home. So these are things you've probably already thought about. So they're slowing down. Automatic devices for blood pressure monitoring. This is another iteration for us that we want to include the blood pressure monitoring, because we're focusing on people with high blood pressure, but blood pressure monitoring for people without high blood pressure. Often, if there's dehydration with fever and illness and stuff. So I'm really over time, aren't I?
Yeah.
Diane.
I enjoyed hearing about the app, and I look forward to talking with you at lunch because I think that you actually can manipulate location with the app.
Really?
So we'll talk more, but I am interested in, you said, when do you give them the alarm? And so what choices are you looking at right now?
Yeah. Until you start actually working on an app, those things seem, like they're not going to be an issue. So our issue is that we have a target time. For the most part, you want people to have a pretty steady state medication blood level. So if you have a target time, like 7 o'clock is when they eat breakfast, that's their target time, then you give them an hour before and an hour after, and that's your target time. So when do they get alarmed? I think and I've talked to them, we were doing structured interviews, and we're also had a little group of 4 of them come in recently, like, when do you want the alarm? I don't want the alarm unless I've missed it. So they want the alarm at the end of the 2-hour window. They don't want it at the target time. They want it at the end of the target time. And that's tricky because if you're working with an app, they have to, now it can be a notification is what my understanding is on an app, so that they will get notified, but you actually have to open the app to discharge it. No?
We'll talk more over lunch.
Oh, I'm so excited.
We actually have an R21 in which we are doing medication prompting based on context. So if we automatically recognize that they take their medicine when they eat, then that's when it gives them the prompt, and it can be proactive.
Yeah. Well, the reason that I believed what these older folks were telling me is because they basically don't want the alarm. They don't want the alarm. They only want the alarm if they didn't take it. So, but I don't know if everybody's like that. I'm talking about 6 people that we've interviewed so far. But I don't know. We're also going to obviously be using, doing usability testing, so we can get at that question again. But I thought it was a simple kind of thing. And yes, every time you change a time base to an event, that's better for prospective memory. Absolutely. That's what's been demonstrated. Yeah.
So 2 questions. One, is the MEMS cap then going to be linked with your app so you'll know if they've taken the medication?
Okay. So for this study, the R21, we're going to use the app concurrently with the MEMS cap for the little field test, and it's just a little field test. They don't give you a lot of money for an R21, as you well know. So this is just a little field test at the end to see if people actually used it. So it's almost a validity check on whether or not the app actually recorded when they took it. So we will use the MEMS cap concurrently. The medications will be in the MEMS cap, in the container with the MEMS cap. So we can see if the app actually works in terms of telling us that it was opened, if that works out to be as good as I think or should be. So
okay, so you would have some information about that. I guess one of the things that I get worried about with the medication and experimenting in this area is with reminders is what if they double take the
Oh, you are so on it.
So how do you,
So
what are you doing for
yeah,
that?
I know, and that's a big deal. So what she's talking about is, so there can be errors of omission and errors of commission. I've got a questionnaire that I use asking people, what do you do if you're confused? Do you take it again or do you skip it? They skip it. I should get that written up, number one, because they're a conservative group and they don't want to overdose. But if you're basing the system on an alarming system, I should tell you this because we've been talking a lot about this, and Gil's very concerned about it. You could get an alarm after you've taken it and not realize that you've taken it. So you have to make sure that they're discharging the notification. Otherwise, the notification is going to stay active. So you see this nice little Apple Watch that I have on my wrist. I'm loving this thing. And with an older adult, I think that the future is to get this on a watch, because then all they have to do is hit it and discharge it. It's done. They don't have to open their phone, they don't have to go into the phone. So that's my future plans, but that's probably off in the distance. But it is an issue, and we're concerned about it, and it will be something that we have to, keep on looking at with the alarming system.
And we've also seen the opposite too, and this was a woman we were working with who was in the mild stages of cognitive impairment, where we were asking her, and these were just kind of fake medications, to let us know if she had taken them, and she would get this notification, and then she would have to hit whether she had taken them or not. And so she would get the notification to actually take the meds, hit that she'd taken them, but
Didn't
not
take them.
Yeah.
Well, there's that. Yep, that's interesting. I'll have to share that with the group. You guys have been so patient. Are you all bored and tired and want to sleep?
Oh, wait, there's...
Oh,
I think what you said about the watch was really interesting. I was curious what, your, thoughts are on the fact that, some older adults might not always have their phone on them, and, how effective and a reminder would be for a generation that didn't grow up with technology.
I think that's a really good question. Certainly something that we've talked about. I think this older adult group is sort of a generation in transition. So the baby boomers, for the most part, have had experience with technology and have positive views of how technology can support their independence. So I don't automatically think that this is a generation of people who haven't got any experience with it. And what I observed with my mom when she got her cell phone, this is an N of one, so it's anecdotal and I wouldn't pay much attention to it, but she carried it in her pocket all the time. But she had other problems with it. So she told me, "You don't call me." And I said, "You don't answer." Well, it turned out, someone that she had come into the house to check her phone, she had turned the sound off. She didn't know it was going off. She didn't know it was ringing. So there are some issues here, and we are in a transitional period of time where we have a group of people entering older age who are familiar. So I think your questions are legitimate, and I don't know how those people are going to respond to the desire that I have for them to all have smartphones, too. Yeah.
Just a suggestion, if you ever switch to the watch, you could also learn the model. So it could be, you could sense that the cap is open, but you could also sense the motion of the hands while you're taking.
Oh my God, I love that.
So you could verify it.
That's great. I hope I didn't cause any, because I just, went, oh. Yeah, see, there are a lot of things that I think that we're just on the brink of. But at the same time, needs are going on, and, it's kind of a fast-moving target. But I like that idea a lot. It's like a machine learning sort of system where you're going to get feedback about how people do something. Yeah, it's amazing to me. I took a Coursera class in big data because I was just kind of curious about it. They could tell by my keystrokes. So if I was tired and kind of had the laptop on my belly and I was laying down in bed, to take the test, they would make me, "No, we don't recognize you." So I had to sit up and actually keyboard in the way I was supposed to keyboard in for them to let me take the test. So I know, isn't that amazing? Because it apparently didn't keystroke like I keystroke, whatever that is. I didn't know that there was that much variability, but I think that's a big deal. The issue of machine learning and being able to really record these algorithms and using that. Yeah. Please change the world for me before I really need these things. Or maybe I'm like one of those people who needs them and doesn't want to recognize it. Okay, is everybody good?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.